Hi, this is Susan Schreibman. I'm delighted to do this for, I think, the third year. And this year we have a panel of both people, several professors here at Maynooth and two industry experts in the field, one in IBM and one Google. So what we're going to do is each have a kind of an opening position, maybe for about 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So Chris will start the talks.
Right, thanks very much, Susan. Yes, my name's Professor Chris Brunsden. I'm actually the director of the National Centre for Geocomputation here at Maynooth University, and I guess the angle I'm coming from, it's partly my job to do certain technical things with big data, particularly with geographical big data, as it were, hence the National Centre for Geocomputation. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So I guess I'd like to start things off by just introducing a few things from my perspective and how I see that kind of thing. So, as I say, that my technical background essentially, without going into too much detail, a bit of computer science, quite a lot of statistics, and then more recently perhaps data science and geocomputation. Also a background in geography and in a certain number of application areas. In particular, I've published stuff on crime, health, house prices and climate change. So generally these are all areas that are quite often generators of big data these days, and they're broadly spatial and geographical applications. So I suppose I perhaps could start by saying, what do I think big data actually is? And basically I'm taking my ideas here from a book called Doing Data Science, Straight Talk from the Front Line, which is by Rachel Schutt and Cathy O'Neill. And the ideas are theirs, the ticks and crosses are mine in terms of this. And basically, I suppose what I'm thinking is, in terms of these ideas here, which of those I see most strongly as being relevant to what I do. I think other people might see it differently, and that's fair enough. The four things they've really got there is, one, big, and what big data is a moving target. It changes all the time. A fairly technical viewpoint is big is when you can't fit all of your data or all of your processing on one single machine, and you have to deal with that. And then possibly big is also a cultural phenomenon, which I'll talk a little bit about towards the end. And then there's this idea of, sometimes use this idea of the four V's: volume, variety, velocity and value. And I've put a cross next to that, not because I don't think it's relevant for some things, but in terms of what I'm doing, I found it was a little bit broad, and whereas these other things tend to relate very directly to what I'm doing, unfortunately, from where I'm standing, then maybe it's a fifth V, which is vague, because I find it a little bit hard to focus on that. But that's just a personal thing. So one of the things, I suppose, going back to the statistics background that I have, is that a lot of things that are part of machine learning, which is certainly a way that big data is often dealt with, are maybe just rebadged statistics. And Robert Tibshirani has released a list where a lot of the times the activities are very similar, but there's different vocabulary used, and there's a sort of example there of different techniques in machine learning with their equivalents in statistics. And I won't go into all of those, but just to say that there is that kind of linkage. But you'll notice two blank things on that table there, and it's another way in which machine learning and stats maybe differ. This is perhaps why we're all data scientists or machine learning experts now. That's what the term typical grant might mean in the two different disciplines there, and where the conference venues are in the two different disciplines there. So, in some sense, we're all data scientists now. Although I think, I'm perhaps being a little bit flippant there, but there are things driving that. Okay, going back to those definitions. Well, firstly, the techie one, which I think I gave one tick to, which is big is when you basically can't fit all your data on one machine. And certainly, from a technical viewpoint, that's the thing that we need to worry about. We do need to implement these techniques for large data sets. And the other thing that's very much a big data thing is quite often we need to do that in real time as well. Old-fashioned statistics, you get your file of data and you go away and analyse it. Quite often this is a stream of data coming in and you've got to deal with it as it happens. And the other thing is, I think the areas of application have expanded greatly as well. So I think that big is when you can't fit it on one machine is true in a kind of techie way, and that's helpful to get things started. The thing about big being a moving target is perhaps one of the more relevant things. It's certainly true that the challenges of big data now are different from the ones that we had a few years ago. I can remember going back to when I started. Big data was kind of data that didn't fit on a floppy disk, and it means perhaps quite a different thing now, but there were those technical challenges then as well. But the present-day challenges are perhaps about the fact that, firstly, the data is coming in on real time, and you've got to analyse it on the fly, and secondly, new forms of data, data that was in a format we didn't see before, and thirdly, data is kind of messy data, and I use this thing, big data equals bad data. Not in a bad way, but it's not nicely behaved always, and you've got to kind of work around that. So just a very quick example. This is some data about house prices, and this is looking at house prices in London and a while back, in fact, and the distribution you've got. And you've got a fairly straightforward statistical model of that there, and that's something that you could look at in the traditional statistical way. But there are other things that you can do with the house price data. One of them is you actually look at the last 3 digits of the house price. So in other words, if you've got a house that's being sold for £150,500, then you just pick out the 500. And you look at these last 3 digits of the house prices, and what you see there is quite interesting patterns. A lot of them start with 0, so in other words, they're just something like £150,000, euros, dollars, or whatever. You get some at something in 250, so 150,000, 250. Quite a few with 500, so midway between. And you also get this sort of bargain basement effect that there's a lot of them at sort of 950 or 995, so they're just sort of below the next price. So again, it's a bit like when you go to the supermarket and you get stuff for £1.99 or something like that. But what's quite interesting is there's perhaps a bit of a psychological thing in that maybe when people are trying to make the houses look cheaper by just selling them under the limit, so something 995, that maybe is something that happens differently, say, in recessions, and it's actually something to do with the confidence of the way people are selling houses, and maybe you can pick up something from that. So part of big data is just looking at data in a slightly different way and noting that these characteristics are there but wouldn't be predicted in a standard statistical model. Moving on to complex data, a lot of the data we get now aren't just lists of numbers like the old sort of statistical analysis that used to be done. And a very good example of that is social media data and Twitter. And what I've got here is a graph showing the basically tweets related to Occupy Wall Street. And when there's a common hashtag, so 2 hashtags in the same tweet, I've drawn a line between them, and you can see the connectivity there. And there's a couple of central ones. One of them is OWS for Occupy Wall Street. The other one's Occupy. And although you can't really see it there, if you zoom in on some of the other hashtags, you can see certain patterns emerging in there, certain other central ones. And of course, the other thing is it is real time, so an hour later it could be different. Time's fairly short, so I'll just skip over this one very quickly, but this was actually looking at modelling climate change by looking at reported first sightings of lilacs and seeing whether that was getting earlier over time. If you actually look at it on a graph, it looks like it's actually getting later, which is counterintuitive. It looks like the opposite's happening. Until you actually look at the fact that the trend in time, this was in the US, and there was a lot of people recording on the West Coast at first, and later on in time, more people on the East Coast got interested, and the centre of gravity of where the recording came from was going towards the colder place, and in fact you've got to allow for that when you're analysing that data as well. So that's kind of messy data. One of the things that you've got to live with a lot of big data is there's no designed experiments. It's not like drug trials or something like that. You have to work with what you're given, but you do have to try to take into account the processes that were generated here, given that they weren't these nice controlled conditions, and only when you do that do you get sensible results out. So finally then, as I say, big is a cultural phenomenon. Now, I'm not going to talk about the social implications of that because there are other people in the room far better qualified to do that than I am. But one of the ways it does affect the culture, it actually affects the culture of us. as data analysts, because I think we do have to think differently about certain methodologies. And as I say, it's not just about size. It's not just because the N is very large in this case. It's because of the form of the data we get, the messiness of the data we get, the fact it's coming in real time, and so forth. And I think part of our job also is perhaps to communicate the potential pitfalls with certain kinds of analysis and avoid the hype and make sure people understand that. And as I say, obviously, social implications of all of this mean that this is a cultural phenomenon in a much more general sense. So very finally, things I'd like to see. As I say, there are pitfalls. It is messy data, and sometimes people perhaps interpret it too simply. So awareness of the existing pitfalls, try to stop people making the mistakes that statisticians knew about and sorted out years ago, but also identifying new pitfalls. There are new kinds of messy data, it's coming in faster, there's going to be new things as well. And we've got to learn to either live with them or find out how to overcome them. So that's one thing I think is an important agenda for future research. And two ways I think that that's quite important, although I don't know how likely it's going to be, are openness and reproducibility. So essentially, when people apply techniques to analyse big data, probably it would be helpful if it is publicly available how that analysis is done, and in such a way that other people could reproduce that analysis if they had certain questions about it and wanted to test it for these pitfalls. Because, as I say, big data is a moving target. The techniques are changing all the time, and the pitfalls and new ones are coming along all the time as well. So I think we really need to focus on that for some future research. So with that, I'll hand over to my colleague.
Right, okay. My name is Rob Kitchen. I'm also a geographer based in Maynooth University. Could I ask the people in Alberta whether they can mute the sound at their end? We're getting a lot of heavy breathing and coughing through our speakers.
I think it might be Madrid as well.
Oh, is it Madrid? Well, I don't know if there's a possibility of muting our speakers. It would be good. So big data and smart cities is what I want to briefly go through. So there's lots of different definitions of smart cities. They generally encompass three different dynamics. The first is the idea of instrumentation and regulation. So this is cities being composed of everywhere, which is really the embedding of ICT infrastructure, devices, sensors and software into cities, different devices, producing big data, and the cities become knowable and controllable in new, dynamic, reactive ways, which enables them to become more efficient, competitive and productive. Second is around policy development and governance, which is really about using ICT to reconfigure human capital and creativity and innovation, education, sustainability and governance, which is about making cities more competitive and entrepreneurial and knowledge-driven. And the third is social innovation and civic engagement and hacktivism, which is really about using ICT to try and create more transparent and accountable governance, new forms of civic participation and better informed citizens. And a key part of this is about the production of big data and feeding those into information management systems and interoperational systems for looking at what's going on. So Chris has already kind of said what his vision of big data is. This is my kind of vision of what big data is, where I would characterise it across a number of things, three of which Chris had, which was volume, velocity and variety. But I also think it's about exhaustivity. So this isn't about samples, it's about entire populations. This is N equals all within a particular domain. So it's not a sample of tweets, it's all tweets. It's not a sample of a population, it's the whole population, using that particular technical domain. It's also about resolution and indexality. So this is moving towards unique identifiers for people, for places, for objects, for territories, and so on, rather than aggregates. And a very fine granularity. It's about relationality. It's about being able to link different data sets together and conjoin them to get more information out of them. And it's about being flexible and scalable. So it's about being able to cope with huge increases of volumes of data very quickly, or being able to change how you generate the data on the fly. So you can do a whole series of A/B testing where you're changing what you're measuring. Whereas something like the census might be very big data. It might be exhaustive, it's the whole population, and so it might have high relationality, but it has no velocity, it's once every 10 years, has no variety, it's basically 30 structured questions, and it has no flexibility. Once they're set, they're set. You can't alter the questions halfway through conducting a census. And then we have these kind of new data coming in really for cities that are coming from all kinds of places, so whether that's digital surveillance and a whole series of digital CCTV and other kinds of sensors like sensors that track your phone between bins or lampposts and so on. So whether it's automated forms of surveillance, whether it's digital devices, so your smartphone is pushing off a huge amount of data at the minute to various kinds of apps and so on, app companies, about your email logs and your calls and where your phone is and so on. Sense and scan data, so sensors in the environment that might be measuring pollution or sound or number of cars along a road and so on. Interactional transactional data, so clickstream on a computer as you visit websites or as you do online banking and so on. And the Internet of Things, so machine-to-machine kinds of communication. And then there's also kind of volunteer data, which is data we give up ourselves through things like Twitter and Facebook and so on, or it might be surveillance. So surveillance is kind of surveillance of yourself. So it's like using wearables and so on, like Fitbit and so on, to measure your own health and look after that. Or it might be crowdsourcing, so things like Wikipedia or OpenStreetMap. Or it might be citizen science. You might have a weather station in your garden that's feeding in data into Wonderground and into weather systems and so on. And this is all producing all this kind of new real-time fairly large samples of data, and it's what we do with these. And it's going to lead into this kind of data-driven urbanism. So these are just some different control rooms. The top left is in Rio, where they're pulling together from 30 different systems, whether that's weather or transport or environment or emergency services and so on. The top right, I think, is Toronto. The bottom left, I think, is Sydney. And the bottom right is actually just a control room for a single motorway. That's the M25's control room for London. But lots of different data coming in, and one of the ways we're trying to make sense of this is through visualising the data, and this is one of the things I'm interested in. And I'm interested in these urban dashboards. So the top left there is London's real-time dashboards, tell you what's going on the underground, what's going on with the weather and pollution and so on. The top right, I think, is IBM product for Chicago. The bottom left is part of the Dublin dashboard, which I'll say a bit more about. And the bottom right is actually Oldham, I think, and some of their data for the city. And you can kind of explore the data through these different kind of visualizations and kind of analytic dashboards. And one that we've developed for Dublin City is called the Dublin Dashboard. And it's providing kind of real-time information relating to transport and to environment, so the water levels, the weather levels, pollution levels, and so on. Or it could be the number of spaces in the car parks, or the road speeds along different segments of the road, where the buses are, where the trains are, and so on. A whole series of interactive graphs and maps around various kinds of public administration data, location-based services, so you can say, where's the nearest bottle bank to me, or the nearest post office to me, and what are its opening hours, and so on. Indicator trends, where you can track what's happening. All the data in the dashboard is open to anybody else to use, so they can build their own apps and so on. And you could also crowdsource information back, so you can kind of say, here's a pothole in my road, and you upload it into the system, and it goes into the CRM, the customer relation management system of the local authority, and they send a team out to go and fix the pothole. Now, that all sounds really great, but as Chris said, there's also some kinds of concerns around these kinds of data. And like, the power of the data is that it kind of suggests that we can kind of know the city in new ways, and we can see it in much more detail and in real time. So we can kind of translate the messiness and the complexities of the city into rational, detailed, systematic, ordered forms of knowledge. And it kind of allows us to know the city as it actually is through this objective, trustworthy and factual data. So it kind of provides this very powerful realist epistemology for monitoring and understanding cities, which is why it's feeding into these kind of operational forms of governance. And it's underpinned by an instrumental rationality in which hard facts trumps other kinds of knowledge and provides the basis for formulating solutions to urban issues. So it trumps experience and practice, and so there's nothing else, because there's hard data here. But of course, dashboards themselves are not simply technical tools. They're framed socially and politically and ethically and philosophically in terms of their form, their selection, their analysis, their deployment. And the data doesn't exist independently of ideas and instruments, practices, context, knowledge and systems used to generate, process and analyse them. And if I was to use a different set of sensors, if I was to use a load of cheap sensors, a load of really expensive calibrated sensors, I might get a different understanding of what's going on. If I output the data at different scales, I can get what's called a modifiable error unit problem. I get ecological fallacy issues, and it will give me a false impression of what's happening. And so on. And the dashboards actually express a normative notion about what should be measured, for what reasons, and what they should tell us, and they have a normative effect in how they influence what goes on in the city. And so that says the tools are never objective and neutral, and nor can they speak for themselves. And the big danger of them is that they potentially atomise very complex contingent relationships into these simplified one-dimensional measures. And they also decontextualise the city from its history and its political economy and its wider social, political and environmental relations. So on the one hand, it gives us all this very good, useful data, but on the other hand, we should be careful not to take that out of context and just react purely on the basis of the data. And I'm going to end there. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob.
It's to Ed now, so I'll virtually pass it to Ed.
Yes. So one of the members of our panel in Maynooth in Ireland is actually in Barcelona at the moment, which is one of the very nice things about this particular conference. So Ed Parsons is here joining us from Barcelona.
Yes, so greetings from the Spanish version of Maynooth University. I'm not sure, it looks quite sunny here, but I promise you it's much sunnier where I am and much warmer. Thank you very much. I've not got a presentation. I've sat through panels of academics before, and we know that these presentations get longer and longer and longer. And I want to try and make sure that there are time for some questions and some interaction later on. So I'm going to keep my comments relatively brief. If I had a title for my slide deck, which I don't have, it would be Bar Humbug. I'm not completely convinced that big data is anything other than a marketing term. I think actually we just live in the days of increasing volumes of data, yes. We live in days where the velocity at which data is created is increasing, yes. And we're living in a time when that data is largely unstructured because it's coming from sources that are no longer really within the control of professionals. The talk of crowdsourcing in the Internet of Things that has been mentioned previously, I think is absolutely right. So we're seeing a massive expansion in terms of the amount of information that's available, its variety, its velocity, its unstructuredness. But then that's just life. I think that's the natural evolution of data when it moves from something that was largely created by organizations and professional bodies to something that the community, to something that machines are creating. And big probably isn't really that big. The fact that we can no longer store data locally, I think, is something that most of us have come to terms with. We're now quite used to storing our information in the cloud. And that information being stored in the cloud, being processed, being used to create patterns for machine learning, a much more empirical world, as Rob correctly pointed out. So I think we just live in a time of increased amounts of data. I'm not a big fan of this terminology. There's some huge benefits as well as some huge issues that obviously that then creates for society as a whole. And I think as a society, we're only really just coming to terms with what all of this means, largely because it's actually quite hard to get a handle on what does big data mean for me as an individual. You know, as someone that spends their time walking around the city of Alberta or walking around Dublin or walking around Madrid, how is big data actually impacting on me in my day-to-day lives? And if it is, how can I tell that it's having an impact? And I think that's something that is only going to emerge over a period of time as we can, in a as clear and transparent way as possible, actually reflect back to society how big data is being used. So I'm going to finish my comments, my very brief comments, with an actual demonstration, believe it or not. I have my mobile phone with me, and on my mobile phone, I actually have every photograph I've ever taken with a digital camera. I'm not sure if you can see this from where you are. there are lots of photographs there, an open one in particular, but there are lots of photographs that are in the order of 18,000 photographs in my phone. It's almost impossible to get the quality of images using the conventional ways of creating albums on a computer or, printing them out and putting them into books. It would just not be feasible. But those images and all the other images that people
Oh, don't lose them.
So I'm next.
Okay. Wait. Sorry.
So that's a pity. We're hoping Ed will rejoin us for the discussion. So this is Susan Schreiman again. I'm the professor of digital humanities here in Maynooth University. I'm going to speak from a very different perspective, but actually there are resonances from what the other speakers have said. And I come from a background in the humanities, actually something very tiny, not really big data. I studied Anglo-Irish poetry. But one of the things I think about a lot in the humanities is, how big is big? The speakers before us were talking about data sets of cities, millions of records, gazillions of tweets. But I think for most of our projects, most of our work, we may have millions of things. So even in the humanities we do. So one of my colleagues, Greg Crane, talked about a decade ago, and he asked the question, what do you do with 1 million books? And at the time, it was virtually unheard of that we would be able to do anything with 1 million books other than go to the library and look at them. But now I think it's quite different. We do, particularly with the Google Book Project, we do have access to 1 million books. Are what we've talked about today. In fact, all the previous speakers have talked about are the visualizations to actually make sense of all this big data. And I was thinking of, what might be a common theme, and this is one of them. But I'd like to talk about a project I'm working on that has made me think about the difference between basically close and distant reading. And it's a kind of hybrid big data project. Because as some of the previous speakers have spoken about, for us, this might be big data, this collection now. It's a collection of letters from the 1916 period, very important period in Irish history. But it both has a lot of letters. At the moment, we have about 2,500, which is more than a person can come to terms with in terms of reading. But we also have quite a lot of metadata with it, very handcrafted, a kind of small data space. But put together, I think there's much more power in the collection than just taking a big data approach. So we have all these letters. It's also a big data project in that we're asking people to collaborate with us. And so we put up these images and people transcribe them. And we do have people around the world working on this. I wanted to talk about the work of one of the PhD students I've been working with. His name's Roman Blair, and he did, as part of one of his projects, some text mining on this. There were about, I think, 1,000 letters when he did this. And one of the things that, again, I think resonates with the other speakers, when I looked at this, we looked at certain things. And if you see there's a kind of, off to the right, a big blue kind of blob with some purple. And we looked at that and we realized, blue is in this typography, letters from the Great War. And what we realized was that they're really clustering together. And we thought, wow, people are using a certain kind of language very tightly when writing about the war. But in fact, when we looked at it a little closer, that wasn't true at all. He didn't take out the named entities. And at the time, we had one very big collection from this letter, Lady Clonbrock. And it all had Lady Clonbrock in it. So it wasn't really about the war or the language that was used. It was named entities. And I think that harks back to something that Chris said, that if there's not a lot of transparency about how this data set and how this visualization is created, you could read this in the way that I've just said and be incorrect in your assumptions. He did it again when we had more and took out the named entities. And this became a really, I think, much more difficult, interesting visualization. And I was quite interested in a couple of blobs, as they were. And one of them is the bottom right, which is all green, which are letters about the rising. And one of the, almost directly above it, which is almost equally green and blue. And these are the topic models that these have come from. And when I read that, in fact, most people, when I talk about this, they can recognize what those two topics, what those letters are about. And the first one are prisoners of war. And we have a lot of prisoners of war who were Irish in British prisoner of war camps, but also Irish who were in British prisoner of war camp because of the Rising. And so one of the things, as a different way to read the Rising, if you look at that top right, green and blue one, is that as a way to read is very different in that no matter why you were in prison, no matter who was incarcerating you, you were writing about the same things. We think of the Irish who rebelled against the British and the Irish who were fighting with the British as being two very different kinds of people. And the last one, I think, is one of the very sad ones, this one, number 5. And in fact, if you look at that, it's all green, and these are letters after the executions of the leaders of the Rising. The last thing I'll just talk about is what I'm calling this kind of middle distance reading. And so when we combine that with a lot of handcrafted metadata, this is in fact a gender map. Blue are male and red is female, and white is we don't know the gender, usually because we can't read the signature. And so because we have this very handcrafted material, we can actually work much more interestingly with the data. So I think I'd like to kind of maybe make a case for big data, maybe not being, I think as everyone's saying, a kind of be-all and end-all, but the necessity of crafting it using very traditional research methods. And I think Mary is last.
Okay, thank you, Susan. So 5 minutes isn't a lot of time to say anything, so I'm just going to be brief, and I wanted to share 5 reasons why I believe that big data, and I would also agree that it's really a marketing term, but analytics is my area, why I believe analytics on large data sets is going to completely transform the future of work. So 5 points for 5 minutes, so here we go. So if we look over the last 20 years, I think it's fair to say that the internet has democratized information. It's made information available to people who would have not historically had access to it. So it's given us a lot more information at our fingertips. We can't find it half the time, but at least it's available to us. I think what we've seen in the last 10 years, more so in the last 5, we've seen that social has now started to democratize things like influence and reputation. Years ago, if you were to be recognized as an expert in your field, you had to have an organization behind you. There was a lot of stuff associated with it. Nowadays, social has given everybody a voice. A lot of those voices don't talk particularly anything of any interest, but there's a lot of voices out there that really are sharing important messages. And we have things like bloggers that have followings and that get readership larger than news channels. So all of a sudden now social has given people a voice and given everybody an opportunity to have influence and reputation. And the final thing is, I think, for me, is where analytics and big data, I believe it's going to actually democratize knowledge and insight. And what I mean by this is, frequently when we think about analytics and big data, we often think about it from the perspective of the corporations, what it's going to tell you about your business, what it's going to tell you about your city. But if I think about us as individuals and human beings, what it's going to ultimately do is give us all access to more insight and knowledge than we've ever had before, if we're able to use it. And an example of this we've seen in the healthcare as an example. So in IBM we have IBM Watson, and what that's looking to do is it consumes huge volumes of clinical data. It analyzes it, it builds models, and essentially what it does is it then provides a mechanism that can help clinicians make better decisions about patients and give them access to information and insight and knowledge that they would maybe not have had access before. And this is particularly important from a democratization perspective, because what it means is A clinician at the Mayo Clinic or Memorial Sloan Kettering would have traditionally had access to this knowledge and insight, but maybe a small clinic in Nairobi or even in Galway in Ireland may not have had access to the same insight, and that is going to change. So that's one thing that I believe that this notion of big data and analytics is going to change the type of information and knowledge that we have, and that's going to affect how we work. It's going to affect our businesses, because if we think about it, if everybody has access to the same knowledge and insight, what differentiates us? So then there's another aspect, which is coming back to the social space. The area that I focus in is people analytics, looking particularly at people networks. And one of the things we've observed as well is that networks are changing how information, how knowledge is transmitted within businesses and outside of businesses. And it's changing how expertise is shared. And what we're seeing, and this touches back on this notion of eminence and reputation, is that it's not just what you know. It's not about your intellectual capital as much as it's about your social capital, who you know, your ability to get the network to collaborate, to participate, to get results, to crowdsource, to be able to put together teams of people to get projects done. And this is another move we see with the future of work. But again, this is another example of a move which cannot be facilitated without analytics. Because one of the things we know about the internet and we know about information is we can't find anything. And we can't find people, we can't find information, there's so much noise, you can't take the signal out of the noise. You don't know what information is reliable versus what is bogus. So again, this is where analytics plays a key role in the enterprise. We see a lot of analytics being done to help identify expertise. Who are experts within an organisation? Where does the expertise reside? Are there certain teams that have a glut of expertise and certain teams that have missing expertise? How can we leverage the intelligence and the collective intelligence of the organisation? So this is another area where we see analytics being critical. The third thing is just taking this one step further and looking at what the role of the employee, what the role of this social capital, this intellectual capital, this expertise plays on the external business. What we've seen, and there's been many, many different studies to look at, the perception that customers have around employees versus companies when they share corporate messages. And the reality is that employees have a much more credible voice, and where customers want to engage with the experts and not with marketers. So the key thing there is, how do companies unleash their employees and not treat employees as marketers, because no employee wants to become a mouthpiece for a company. But how do we enable our customers to have access to our employees in order to help solve problems? How do we allow potential customers to have access to our employees when they want to better understand some of our value proposition? Again, in order to be able to do this, we need analytics. An example, we in IBM, we do a lot of work around employee advocacy. We do a lot of work around measuring expertise, influence, information brokers within the company. And the reason we do this is to help us understand which of our employees have the potential to really go out there and be key advocates, be able to engage with people, because it's not just about expertise. Again, your social capital is about your ability to communicate those messages. So again, analytics is going to be critical if we want employee advocacy to become a reality. The fourth thing is networks, about this move from rigid command and control structures to more fluid, agile networks. There's the meme out on the internet, the future of work, which talks about how we're moving away from more formal hierarchical controls within companies and to something that's a bit more agile. The picture up above there is an IBM country, and it's a picture of the map, the network map of exactly how people interact with each other. It's our kind of a social network. And I can tell you that this does not represent closely the actual physical hierarchical organisation of the team. Mainly because we've got a matrix organisation, we're global, we leverage expertise across many, many different teams. And this is not dissimilar to what we're seeing across companies. So if we believe that there's benefit to being agile, There's benefit to having networks as opposed to hierarchies. We can only make this will only effectively happen if we have analytics that allows us to visualize, for example, what's happening within those networks. If we want to understand, if we want to put together teams, and we're no longer relying on structured hierarchies to know this is the team that does big data, this is the team that does social. If we're relying on where the skills reside, then we again need analytics to be able to enable us to put the teams together. If we want to get messages out to people within the organisation, we have to be able to identify who the information brokers are, who the influencers are. So again, analytics. In order to do this, this is where I think one of the biggest sources of big data, and it has all the characteristics that we mentioned before. It's unstructured, it's network data, it's real time, it's very, very large, it's a lot of text. Social and collaboration systems have such a wealth of data that has been historically under-leveraged within the enterprise. Under-leveraged because it's been very large, because it's been very unstructured, and this is something that I firmly believe is going to change, is changing, because there's many, many different use cases. All the previous ones I mentioned, they rely heavily on your ability to harness and leverage the collaboration and social data. And in some of the research we've done, there's some many, many different examples. For example, we've looked at the correlation between engagement and innovation within a company. We've looked at how the networks within a company will affect attrition rates. We've looked at how they can affect employee satisfaction, employee productivity. So there's lots of different ways that understanding this network can help the business be more effective as well as make individuals more effective. And on that note, I will finish. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I didn't even have to use my iPhone in time, everyone. So we wanted to open up the conversation to questions from people here. I have one, if nobody else has one. So one of the things that I thought about when Rob was speaking, and again when Marie was speaking, is, and my note was kind of, what's the impact on me? All these, I realize that I give up some information about myself when I use my phone. If I get one of those smart watches, I'm going to give up even more information. I know when I go from one place to another, I'm being kind of tracked by cameras. There's a wonderful novel by William Trevor that takes place, I think, about 1922, 1923 in Ireland, and it's about something that happens on an estate, and it seems like the little girl has died, and the parents in grief go abroad. And the rest of the novel is trying to get in touch with these parents who just go from one place to the next, leave a note that they're moving on to Italy or France, and it always strikes me that situation is just almost incomprehensible today, that we're so out of touch. And so I wonder what the impact on me is. Is it important that I lose so much of this word privacy for another good? Or is that just the way it is? I feel like I'm also being, the target of all kinds of marketing that's more and more crafted to me. Every time I open, all these algorithms and companies are getting so much better at it.
There's a trade. There's a trade where you give your data for certain services, and you might get certain offers to you, and so on. And this makes your life easier. You can do things on the fly much easier, and you can get information when you're moving around and so on. But you definitely trade on it as well. So you can look at it as a positive thing, in that it helps us understand cities better, and it helps us understand companies better, or our health better, and so on. But the data is being used in various different ways, and some of those ways include things like social sorting. So the data is used to see whether you'll get a loan, or whether you'll get tenancy, or whether you'll get the job, or whether you'll be allowed to travel in certain forms and so on. It can be used towards dynamic pricing. So people paying different amounts of money for different things depending on how they're valued by the company and whether they want to take certain risks around that person. There's issues around things like predictive profiling and surveillance and policing and anticipatory governance and so on. So anticipatory governance is where the data precedes you. So people make judgments about you on the basis of your data and then make decisions about you. So and there are programs in policing in the US which are about trying to identify criminals before they're criminals.
But
and
it
actually
might also get me, and I'm not a criminal.
Exactly, but you would then be labelled as a pre-criminal. Now that's fine. That's fine as if the data just stays in that database. But if that data is then sold and then you don't get the job on the basis of you might have done something which you have not been actually proven to have been done.
Or I could do something.
Or you could do something. And a lot of this data is being traded. So there's a huge multi-billion-dollar data market where lots of this data is being moved around the world and sold on from different companies to different companies, and that is being used to profile you and to make decisions about you.
And I think that's the real concern, because you mentioned it yourself, and I think a few people have mentioned about data and out of context. Yes. If a piece of information has been generated about you in a certain context, and that piece of data then gets sold on, frequently the context around that doesn't actually follow the piece of data, the insight that was generated. So now it's completely out of context, and it can be totally misinterpreted. So I do think I'm a big believer, obviously, in sharing and stuff like that, but I do feel that there's a concern probably on a couple of different levels. One is I think from a it's less about privacy actually as much as it's about the use of data, about transparency. I do think there's an issue that the law, and not just even the law, society hasn't caught up with what's happening with data. And I do think we need to be more socially aware of the implications of it. Something that looks harmless in one context, if it's taken out of context and intersected with another piece of data. So a piece of data, Marie loves a good glass of wine, and now all of a sudden that data goes in context with some other data, and then she's refused insurance or something because she just had a glass of wine. I think people need to be educated. I think my big thing is setting the notion of transparency, ultimate transparency, and the ability to decide how the data is consumed. But I do think there's another aspect, which is something, the ease with which we rely on our phones. It's the first thing we see when we get up in the morning, and it's normally the last thing we see before we get to bed at night. It's the reality for a lot of people, and I think that has a cultural implications, which I actually think is more concerning to some extent. That when we stop, I spoke to somebody recently, and they said that the next social tool that the young children are using is videos on text videos. And I'm like, text audio, like these audio things. And I said, why wouldn't they pick up the phone, or why would they go to each other? No, because they'd rather have the disconnected. So you send a piece of audio, they listen to it, then send another piece back. So we're just separating ourselves. We're separating ourselves further and further from each other. And I do think, to some extent, I wonder what happens with all this analytics and technology and what it's going to do for us as a society. So that, I think, is another interesting question.
So how much of that do you think falls on the responsibility of those who are collecting the data and using the data, and how much do you think we as people are sort of complicit in that, putting the data out there and responsible for the fact that it exists in the first place?
I think the data isn't the problem. I think the data existing is absolutely perfectly fine. I think our willingness to accept what happens to our data without questioning it, I think, and even when something bad happens, like there's been a few incidents which I won't mention where data has been fairly badly treated and nobody even hiccuped. There was no outrage. There was outrage from the pundits and from the experts in the field, but the average Joe didn't seem to mind. So I do think there's complicity on both sides, and that's why I think education and government programs and to educate people so that they're a little bit more aware of what's happening, and then that in turn will make companies more thoughtful, because if they know that people know what's happening and they're aware, then as a result companies will end up being a bit more careful about what they're doing with the data.
I think it's also, it's following on from this, it's almost an idea of sort of informed consent. A lot of people are consenting, but it's not really informed consent.
They have no idea what they're consenting to.
They tick the box, 30 pages of stuff, and then they say, yes, I agree to this.
Legal obfuscation,
I think that's changing. So there are indications. So Agnieszka Leszensky's done a lot of work on this kind of difference between surveillance anxiety, control anxiety. So there's an anxiety around your data being collected, and then there's another one about what actually happens to the data when it is collected. And people are now starting to intervene. So I think it's something like 45% of teenagers in the US will turn off their location tracking. Like, they are actually aware that this thing is tracking them, and they will turn it off on certain apps, or they'll turn it off on the phone in general. They'll turn it on and off in different contexts. They might be much more careful about what they say on particular social media channels. They might swap between several different social media channels. They might delete their Facebook account and create another one. So there's lots of little different tactics and strategies that I think people are adopting as they get more more used to having to think about these kinds of things, and we know that there have been fairly sizable data breaches on different companies and so on. I mean, there are.
What I was going to say is that just coming back on that, I think it's also interesting, perhaps going right back to the sort of big data implications, because in a sense, it means that idea of N equals everyone isn't quite right, because in this case, N is those people that have consented to leave their GPS tracking on, and maybe they behave very differently from people who don't in other ways as well.
So does that then affect the reliability of statistical data that we collect using big data?
Yeah, very much so, because if you go back to the standard statistical models, you're assuming a random sample. It's not that. It's it's
completely unrepresentative.
Yeah.
It's representative of people who are on Twitter. It's not representative of the population. So there are all these kinds of questions now. So, like, national statistics agencies at the minute are being pressured into thinking about using big data in official statistics, and that's one of their really big concerns. Is the data is simply not representative of a population. So how do you deal with that? There is an issue, I think, around some of these really large data brokers, and that actually we don't really know what goes inside on. The algorithms are black boxed, but there are consequences that come out of both the data and the algorithms, but we don't have any way of unpicking that. So if I end up on a no-fly list, I have no way of finding out why I'm not on, and I have no way of verifying the data that led to that, and I have no way of verifying the algorithm that led to that. So I have no right of appeal. And that's the same on whether I don't get insurance, or if I don't get the tenancy, if I don't get the job. It's very difficult for me to come back on. So there has to be some mechanism of creating some transparency so that we can see what is going on.
Yeah, that's true.
And also some transparency about where the hell our data goes. Like, where does it get trailed around? Who is it being sold on to?
Yeah, there is something once you've
who is Facebook selling their data to, and for what purpose, and so on. We don't.
If I tried to publish a thing in a journal and didn't give access to my data, no one would use it.
I just wanted to see if Ed wanted to come in on the conversation.
Hey.
The shadow of himself.
Ed, would you like to come in on the conversation?
I'll try to. My connection will last more than 2 minutes. I missed it because I've been disconnected every few seconds. It's just a poor internet connection at my end. I wanted to actually show you this demo that proves, I think, the value of big data. And it's the value of big data in the effort in allowing machine learning to help us all as individuals. I remember my problem was I had all of those photographs online on my phone. Okay, Google, show me my pictures of a New York taxi.
Showing pictures matching your request.
I don't know if you can see this, but there's a picture there of my children getting out of a taxi in New York. That's one of about 18,000 photographs. Now, what happened there is we did voice recognition, which was based on sampling many, many millions of people's voices to understand those. And then we've done image recognition. We can actually recognize what a New York taxi looks like in someone's photograph, and then use that to present information back. And when we get, increasingly large volumes of information like this, there's no other way of managing the information other than this intelligence.
That's it. Very cool. Yeah.
That is really good.
Yeah. I can never find any photographs.
It works as long as it's a yellow cab and not an Uber cab. It's as long as it's got. Yeah, it's as long as it's got stable types.
Which works for most people, because it knows your family. If you want to let me find the photograph of mom and dad. At Christmas, and so it can kind of do stuff like that. I'm assuming.
Yeah.
I remember
so I don't think
the voice recognition as well is based on those contributions made by hundreds of millions of anonymous users, and I think we sometimes undervalue those sort of crowd contributions that are increasing the intelligence of the network, if you like, and bring back that community.
Yeah, I don't think anybody would dispute that there's lots and lots of value in big data, and you can answer lots of different questions. I mean, you can certainly get a much deeper, richer understanding of Dublin through the dashboard, for example. The question is whether the debates around the politics and the ethics and some of the social, cultural issues that come up, that accompany that, whether they're keeping pace with some of the technological developments, and whether the regulation and governance and legal side is also given the protections to to people as well. And I think that's the bit that we're really lacking on. And that's partly because the technology is just moving so fast.
Yeah.
You know, like 7 or 8 years ago, most of us in this room wouldn't have had one of these. And, you know, if you think about the speed at which, like, the Internet of Things, for example, it's been around for a while. So a lot of this stuff's been around for a while, like remote sensing data, weather data, financial data, was big data, real-time data, decades ago, right? But there's been an explosion across all kinds of domains. The same kind of thing. So Internet of Things has been around for a while, but it's really exploded in the last few years, and it creates a whole series of other questions that go along with it. What does it mean to have all of these different devices embedded into our environments which can survey us all the time, so that you're never ever outside of something? Now, they might not all be connected up and talk to each other, but something. If you're in Chicago, you are definitely being tracked by something, either a sensor or a camera or a transponder or something is monitoring you as you move around that city, you know. So, but we don't have a sense of like the political, ethical questions that go along with all of that, and also some of the solutions around some of the things around transparency we've talked about that also go along with that. And I think that's the bit that we're grappling with.
Yes.
I mean, we're also, as Chris has said, grappling with the technical side, and as Ed has said, the technical side of actually how do you actually cope with this volume of data
I think the
extract
technical
value from
side
it?
is less of an issue. I think the technical side is very solvable. For me, I think the social aspects of it is probably the bigger challenge.
Catch up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think part of the issue is as individuals, we still really haven't been impacted in a very negative way by big data, or if we have, we haven't perceived it yet. So as a result, the mechanisms in place to protect us are not there because it's not perceived as an issue yet. And it's probably only a matter of time before it is, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate that something bad will have to happen before we all wake up.
I think there's another issue that relates to that, which is also an interpretational side of the analytics, which is different from the technical side. So, for example, if you have things like probability that someone was going to cause trouble on a flight that ends up in a no-fly list, what that effectively means is that if you had a group of people all with these characteristics of, say, 1,000 people, and you've got a 0.8, then that means there's going to be, on average, about 800 of them that would possibly cause a problem, but you don't know which 800 out of 1,000, so you still can't say of an individual that person will definitely be a problem. So there are then ethical implications related to that as well, of making that a deduction about an individual when probabilities don't really work that way. They're about long-term trends for large numbers of things.
Yeah, that's a good point, because statistics has generally been about we generalize things to plan possibilities and stuff like that. That's been used in marketing or in psychological studies, but it hasn't directly impacted individuals in the same way that, you have these characteristics, so you might have a 10% chance of causing this problem, so you're on a no-fly list. That's a much more direct consequence.
But I think, as Ed was saying, it does actually affect us. Like, whether we know it or not, we are being socially sorted. Like,
that's true.
Like, what premium I get from my insurance will be different from your premium, because analytics are doing work on me on the basis of my history of driving and so on, and my age profile and so on. And it might have also got other data from other sources about me, or whether I get the job if a company's gone off to go and use some other agency and so on. So I don't know why I didn't get the job, I just know I didn't get it.
And I think the other thing is, as well, as the manipulation aspect as well. I mean, that's, to some extent, that has been historically, we've all been targeted by marketing, and we know this, but now it's more pervasive. It's coming through every single thing we do. We're being manipulated by the ads we get, or not even ads, by the articles we see, or by the people that were suggested we meet, or the products that show up in weird places, and they don't even look like ads. So I think the level of manipulation as well is another thing that can be a little bit concerning.
Yeah. Well, it's nudge, isn't it? So this notion of nudge marketing. So it tries to find the things that you like, and it tries to nudge you towards.
And it might look to long-term things as well. So it might look to move you towards a certain direction, to buy something in 6 months from now, which can take advantage of your emotional state and your physical state and other states at different times. So it is. Those. Behind it, if you have an unethical company, it is very scary. But hopefully, we'll get rid of those.
Didn't Facebook run into that issue?
Oh yeah, they did.
Yeah.
I think 500 people received positive information on the newsfeed, whereas 500 received.
No, it's 500 billion. Every single Facebook they did it across. It was a massive. Experiment. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It wasn't a small experiment at all. It was massive. Yeah.
So we're only a few years off from this minority report.
Do you need to sum up because we've only got half a minute?
I think we only have a minute left. I wanted to thank everybody who's been speaking. Ed, who joined us from Barcelona, my colleagues here, Rob and Chris and Marie, who came in. And Jeffrey, thank you very much for organising this again and inviting Maynooth University to be part of the symposium.